We definitely want engagement in this web group gathered together tonight with a lot of expertise and experience to guide us through this important discussion. So welcome to Women in Philanthropy's third webinar in the Learning to Break Barriers webinar series. I'm Laura Duchessi, President and CEO of the Scranton Area Community Foundation, and we're very grateful to our esteemed panelists who are joining us to talk about affordable and attainable housing. Now in its 7th year, Women in Philanthropy has a strong history of helping women and girls break barriers, transform their lives, and lift themselves and their families out of poverty. Over the past 7 years, Women in Philanthropy has focused on 4 impact areas: entrepreneurship, financial confidence, STEAM education, and healthcare, all with the generous support of over 100 Women in Philanthropy supporters. Along with an exploration of civic engagement and advocacy, and childcare and early childhood education, this session on housing is part of an examination of how Women in Philanthropy can continue to be a powerful change agent in the lives of women and girls in northeastern Pennsylvania. A few stats just before we get into the discussion tonight. According to a recent report from the Institute for Public Policy and Economic Development, 30% of all households in the Lackawanna County area are cost burdened, meaning they spend 30% or more of their income on housing. This is higher than the statewide level and about on par with the national level. Also of note is that a greater share of owner-occupied households are cost burdened in Lackawanna County than in any other Pennsylvania region except for Philadelphia. And what does that mean? Well, it means that cost-burdened households are more likely to sacrifice other necessities like food, like healthcare, to pay the mortgage, and to experience unstable housing situations like evictions, and potentially more likely to become homeless. So expanding the effort to provide affordable and attainable housing can contribute to a local purchasing power expansion, neighborhood vitality, and improved neighborhood quality. And many studies have found that investments in affordable housing produce benefits in forms of job, income, property values, and tax revenues. So we've gathered an impressive group of individuals this evening who can further speak to the critical importance of affordable housing needs in the Lackawanna County region. And I think Maggie provided insight for how to get involved in the discussion. We definitely want to make it an engaged discussion. So I want to first thank our panel, but I want to also thank and introduce our moderator this evening, Linda Champi, the Executive Director of Outreach and a WIP supporter. Linda received her bachelor's and her master's degrees from the University of Scranton and has done advanced coursework in public administration from Merriwood University. She brings over 30 years of progressive experience in the nonprofit sector, including senior executive level positions with multi-state organizations. Prior to joining Outreach, Linda has held positions with Diakon Lutheran Social Ministries, Kids Peace, and EHAB Human Services. Thank you for leading our discussion tonight, Linda. I will also introduce the rest of our panelists. Maura is the Director of Community Services at United Neighborhood Centers.
Laura, I'm just going to pause you. We don't have Maura on just yet.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully Maura will be joining us. Maureen Maher-Grey has been raising awareness about the lack of constitutional protections for LGBT individuals in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodation for many years. She was hired at Equality Pennsylvania in 2014, fighting for LGBT protections in 15 counties in eastern Pennsylvania. Upon completion of her contract, Maureen began the nonprofit NEPA Youth Shelter in 2016 with 2 purposes in mind: to provide safe and supervised space for teens to hang out, and to provide emergency and long-term housing for teens ages 18 to 21 in crisis. Peg Ruddy. Peg is a graduate of Marywood College's School of Social Work, where she earned a master's degree in 1990. She began her career with the Women's Resource Center in 1984 and assumed her current role of executive director in 1992. Throughout her tenure, she's raised substantial funds for the Women's Resource Center, has initiated numerous programs related to temporary shelter and transitional housing, created the Barbara J. Hart Justice Center, and created an empty place at the table, a memorial exhibit to remember and honor the lives of children, women and children murdered in acts of domestic violence. She was also the Clemency Project Director at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Harrisburg and is a current WHIP supporter. Jesse Ergott is President and CEO of NeighborWorks Northeastern Pennsylvania. He served in the community development field for over 15 years and has focused his efforts on promoting home ownership and quality housing as a key tool for increasing the financial stability of families, helping seniors to age in their home with dignity, and strengthening the neighborhoods we call home. He's also taken a lead role in the region's response to foreclosures and the reciprocal effects on families, communities, and local government. Gary Drapek is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the United Way of Lackawanna and Wayne counties. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the Pennsylvania State University and joined the United Way of Lackawanna County in 1987 as Vice President of Marketing and Public Relations, a position which he held for 12 years. In 1999, he left the United Way to become Vice President of Communications for Condren Media. He returned again to the United Way in August of 2002 as President and Chief Professional Officer, where he's worked to successfully transform the organization from a fundraising and funding model to a nationally recognized community problem-solving organization. Mary Pat Ward is the Deputy Director of the Office of Economic and Community Development for the City of Scranton. Prior to her time with the city, she was the legal assistant for over 8 years at the Barbara J. Hart Justice Center at the Women's Resource Center. She formerly served on the executive board of the Catherine McAuley Center of Scranton and chaired their Program Effectiveness Committee. In 2005, Mary Pat found herself homeless while caring for her toddler daughter, Isabella. She utilized the services of the McAuley Center and other public service agencies, which allowed her to find stable and permanent housing, finish school, and start her career. She currently serves on the steering committees for both West Scranton and Pine Brook revitalization projects and took part in the University of Scranton's Kenya School of Business nonprofit leadership certificate program. What an esteemed panel we have with us tonight, and I can't wait for the dialogue. Thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of you, all of our WHIP supporters, for all that you do to help transform the lives of women and girls in our community, and for joining with us on this learning journey tonight. All right, thank you. Linda?
Thank you so much, Laura. And I can't imagine a greater group of experts to be assembled for this particular topic than those you have assembled this evening, because if I were to have any issues, or if our staff and our participants would have any cause for concern about housing and how they might obtain specific instruction, direction, support, these are the folks that are our go-to in our community. So I'm very, very grateful that each one of them has a role in what we're dealing with on this particular issue. The first question that we have—
Actually, Linda, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to let you know that Maura was able to join. I'm actually going to update her name. We didn't realize she was under a different username. So if Laura, if you want to do Maura's introduction really quick, and I'll update her name on the screen, and then we get into the questions. I apologize, Linda.
No, thank you, Maggie. Laura, will you be introducing?
Yes, just unmuting myself. My apologies. Welcome, Maura Mark, the Director of Community Services at United Neighborhood Centers, who holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and has more than 20 years experience in counseling diverse client populations and managing various programs in several local human service agencies. Maura started at United Neighborhood Centers in 2016 as a housing counselor and currently oversees 14 community service programs, including basic needs assistance, crisis intervention, housing and homeless support, and cross-county outreach, among others. Welcome, Maura.
Thank you.
So it seems like we have the entire panel assembled, which is absolutely wonderful, and we can get started on the questions. And as I said earlier, I couldn't think of a better team on a panel to be able to address the issue at hand. I will say that there's nothing probably more important than anyone wanting to feel at home in their own home. So Gary, the first question here is for you. Why is affordable housing an issue within our communities? How has the current pandemic impacted housing issues?
Well, Linda, thank you. And it's a great question. Housing, going back in at least my history, limited history, housing has always been an issue in this region. But we can't just simply look at the housing issue without looking at the broader issues surrounding housing. Housing is systemic, I think, of the loop of poverty that we're all seeing in this region. Now, it depends on what statistics you're looking at today, but there's about 40% of households in the Lackawanna County area, according to a recent study, excuse me, that are at or that are below, at, or just above the poverty level in our region. And by the way, 42% of that group are seniors, are led by senior households. Now, and the problem with it, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Stable wages in our area are estimated at about $24 an hour, which would come out to about $49,000 a year. Now, what do I mean by stable wage? A stable wage will allow someone to, and that's like a mom and a dad with one child, will allow someone to, put food on the table, possibly have some savings, possibly do some child care, maybe once in a while, and also have affordable housing, whether it be rent or a house. So where are we today? In our region today, the average wage is somewhere, again, depending upon what statistics you're looking at $10 an hour. So the same families, the same 40% are looking at $10 an hour, which comes out to $28,000, about $28,000 a year. Now, so we think about housing, but that $28,000 a year has to put food on the table, has to pay the utilities, possibly has to pay some child care. And so housing actually becomes, affordable housing actually becomes more of a dream than a reality. So before we could look at just housing, I think we have to look at the loop as a whole of the systemic loop of what we call the systemic loop of poverty. The pandemic put an interesting twist onto all of this, and we were just looking at some figures today. We all know that the feds handed down the moratorium on evictions, which was a great thing, and it was a nice, and it was very humanitarian, and it was a nice stoppage back in March or April when this happened. But basically what this did is it kicked the can down the road. These mortgages and these rents still have to be paid somewhere and some time down the road. One of the things that we saw that we didn't expect was, because of this edict, renters refused to rent. They would not rent their available apartments. So we at the United Way began to get phone calls to put individuals up in temporary housing because they just couldn't find an apartment, because renters wouldn't rent to them out of fear of not being able to collect the rent and then evict them once if they didn't pay their rent. In fact, last year, between the months of March and I think June, was probably one of the highest times for the United Way, when we expended the most dollars, the most resources to put families and individuals up in temporary housing. So the whole issue of housing, we can't look at it as just one issue. It's a myriad of issues that are affecting families across our region.
Thank you, Gary. That's important for us to understand, that there is a systemic issue in front of us with housing. It's not just about the housing. The next question is for Mary Pat, Peg, and Maura. What are the key barriers that face those trying to obtain affordable and accessible housing, particularly low to moderate income women and families? And if we could start with you, Mary Pat.
Sure, thank you. So for me, it's through my experience and currently what we're seeing, it's simply knowing what's out there. I think for a lot of women who are the head of households, you're looking at them, trying to do everything. And when you also need to navigate the systems that help you, if it's through public assistance, subsidized daycare, subsidized housing, those are monumental tasks, because you're not operating in a vacuum, that you have to do everything on top of that. It's often time consuming. It can be soul sucking and humiliating, and it costs a lot, right? It costs mentally a lot and physically a lot. And that's just to get to the baseline of housing. We're not even going into quality or dignified housing. And so that can be a monumental hurdle for women especially.
Greg, I would think that you would probably cooperate with what Mary Pat is saying, and then some.
Absolutely. One thing I just want to start out with before I answer the question specifically is, Gary spoke about the pandemic. We've seen an increase of 134 nights per month of requests for safe housing since before the pandemic. And so we start to see that backlog of survivors of domestic violence needing safe, affordable housing, and it gets to be a real challenge, even for agencies like ours that have, resources. But one of the nuances to the obstacles for our program participants is danger. There are, a lot of landowners out there that are really leery about renting to someone if the Women's Resource Center is involved. So you might say, how do they know we're involved? Well, we're involved because we have subsidies. And, we have to enter into a contract. And it's only gotten worse since, the last pandemic, that landlords, I know it's against the law for fair housing, but danger is a significant obstacle, and danger in their lives and being stalked and harassed. The other obstacle is violence, and I'll conclude with this for this question. As many of you know, we respond to hospital calls if there's a survivor of sexual assault there. And a couple of years ago, and it's only gotten worse, I responded to a hospital call where there was a 14-year-old teenager who was raped by her grandmother's landlord. Now, the 14-year-old was living with the grandmother, and the grandmother was very, very intense on not having the police called or the rape reported because they would have nowhere else to go. And so when you start to take a look at sexual assault and poverty, those kinds of, the woman is looking at their call, police are going to be called and we're going to be homeless. What a position to put a 14-year-old in. So we were able to assist that family, but, after all these years, it really opened my eyes in terms of the choices that some families have to make around their housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Peg. And I think you're right that it is very, very difficult. Laura mentioned earlier, do I pay the bills for my health care? Do I pay, buy food, or do I have a home to live in? And those aren't choices anyone should have to make because they're very basic needs. Maura, your thoughts about this question?
So in my experience as a housing counselor and what I see right now and what I'm doing, I think it's a lot to do with the combination of childcare, lack of transportation, and also job security. A lot of single moms working, multiple jobs, trying to make ends meet. And then also that affects the childcare, trying to find childcare at odd hours that their jobs are. And along with transportation, the buses, they don't run that long during the day, trying to find transportation to get to and from the job, which then affects them losing the job, which then is just a vicious cycle.
And it gets back to what Gary said originally about this systematic piece of what we're dealing with housing as you're speaking to these barriers. So I'm going to ask Peg, what percentage of your clients' income currently goes to their housing costs, and how does it impact their quality of life?
So there's two responses I have to that. Individuals that we are able to provide rapid rehousing or transitional housing or housing subsidies to, we work really hard with them to keep them in that 30%. So they're not going over 30%. Survivors of domestic and sexual violence that aren't a part of that program, because sometimes we're just tapped out. The majority of those survivors spend over 50% of their incomes on housing.
Wow, that's pretty high. That's pretty significant.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, I just spoke with Carol Schoner about it earlier today to make sure that that number was still current, and it is.
Maura, do you have a thought about that question?
Yeah, I'm going to say what we see is about more than half of their income is spent on affordable housing.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And Maureen?
Well, my clients are a little bit different in that we are 18 to 21-year-olds, and we provide a subsidy also to help them afford to stay in an apartment, because our clients generally are still in high school. And we know that historically, for any kid to be able to afford to live on their own, they would have to quit school. And we are trying to keep them in school. So we provide subsidies for rent and utilities and food to make sure they stay in school. And our contract with our teens is for 1 year. So in that time, we try to develop independence, financial independence. So by the time they're finished with the subsidies that we provide, they are able to support themselves. But, we have one young man who makes $10 an hour, and he worked 40 hours a week, and he had to get a roommate because he just didn't make enough money to be able to afford his apartment. One other person spends almost 50% of his monthly income on rent. And our third teen is not working, so we are paying 100% of his rent right now until he gets a job.
And in listening to this 50%, the question comes to my mind about the availability. Even at that 50% mark, is there available housing at that 50% mark? Because to me, I'm hearing that there's such a struggle. We originally heard the 30%, now we're talking about 50%, and that's pretty significant, knowing everything else that an individual has to have in an income to survive in this day and age. I'm going to ask a few of you about this next question, and maybe we can start with Mary Pat. But what impacts do housing costs and affordability impact on the overall quality of life for those whom you serve?
Impact of unstable housing or homelessness is far-reaching, cyclical, and often generational in the way that, even for a small amount of time of being homeless, for, families, mothers and children, can have years of impact. I deal in numbers a lot, obviously, as a funder for many of our social service programs. And so just wanted to provide some statistics. It's through the U.S. Department of Human Services. Disability rates for adults are 2.6 times higher for those that have experienced unstable housing or homelessness. For homeless, 75% nationally, you see moms with high school diplomas or GED equivalents. For those that have experienced housing issues and homelessness, only 42% of those women are high school graduates. When asked about support from homeless moms, what support they received, they are 5 times more likely to say that their first support is their children, their minor children, that are the support for them, during their time of homelessness. And then those statistics, like I said, that have far-reaching impacts. And I think Maureen will understand these statistics as well as Peg, is that 44% of homeless mothers reported that sexual assault by a family member took place before the age of 18, and that 66% of women that have experienced homelessness have been the victim and survivor of severe physical abuse before the time they were even 18 years old. So you can see something that should be a basic right, and we're not even we're just talking about a home. We're not even talking about dignified living, what the impact of that could be for women and children.
That's significant. Jesse, your thoughts on the impact?
You know, one of the things that comes to mind at NeighborWorks, we really try to build all of our programs, services around this one concept that home is where it all starts. That's kind of what our, one of the things that we try to build as a foundation of who we are and what we do. And it really speaks to, everything that you're hearing from the other panelists right now is that, if you have a stable place to call home, that impacts your ability to get education. It impacts your safety, as we heard. It impacts your health in many different ways. There's so many different connections that we're hearing about between the quality of your housing and your health. Many studies have really come out in the last 5 to 8 years about that fact. When I think about this topic specifically, sometimes I go right to the older populations that we serve through our Aging in Place program. And it's really well documented on that side too. 9 out of 10 seniors want to stay in their home as they age. They don't want to move to assisted living or another type of living arrangement. And that sometimes it really comes back to that stability factor. It's peace of mind, it's comfort, it's independence, it's dignity that is achieved by staying in a familiar setting. And for us, any of us who've kind of been through that process where we may have had to assist with moving a family member out of kind of a familiar living situation or a home that they've been in a long time into something that may not be as familiar to them, can vouch for how challenging that can be, both for the family and the person who's going through that process. But unfortunately, I think in a community like ours, when you see the age of the housing stock that we have here, and the age of our population, and many folks who are modest means, fixed incomes, things like that, they can't afford to keep those properties up as they age, right? The ability economically to modify that property and make it livable, as their needs change, is kind of out of their reach. And so, the effects that has on their quality of life can be significant, right? If you're someone who's used to independence and now you have to have somebody come in to help you bathe or cook or do those types of things, right? That has a major effect on folks. So, the way we approach that work is, how do we remove as many of those barriers to people being able to stay in those homes as possible? We would much rather try to find a way to invest, $8,000 into a walk-in shower on a first floor bathroom than to see somebody have to get caregiving support for 10 years for somebody to help them bathe, right? If you can remove that barrier and help them to be independent, it greatly increases their quality of life over a long period of time, and most of the time saves resources as well.
Thank you, Jesse. Maureen, what do you believe are the tools and needs in creating sustainable housing stability for the most vulnerable populations?
That's a question that could take the whole hour. It's housing stability, and again, I'm thinking about the 3 teens that we are working with. It allows them to go to school regularly, not be tardy. They have their own safe space that they can retreat to if they have stresses or anything. Our 3 teens don't live with an adult guardian; they live independently. But having an address that they can call their own is significant in their terms of their mental health, their emotional health, and for some of the kids who really need to burn some energy, if the house is a little bit of a distance, they can run or walk or ride a bike and get some of that energy out of their system. But it's to sustain that beyond the time that we provide for these kids is difficult because of their lack of proper income to be able to afford to stay in decent housing. It weighs on my mind how we're going to continue this program. You know, we do have limited funds, of course, but we want to continue to help that population, and just providing that safety and that security for them to be able to live a, quote unquote, what we would call a normal life. Even though it's individually living on their own without adults present. Super important for them to be able to, for teens especially, there's a lot of stress socially, and having a home of your own to be able to retreat to takes a lot of stress off.
We've talked a little bit about individuals, and at one point we talked about women and families. I have a question, I'm not sure who to direct it to, but it's in relationship to women or single parents who have the need for housing for multiple children. And how do we get these resources? Are these available? And how do we get them? Because I'm understanding that that's a challenge for some families.
One of the projects that, albeit small, and we can grow, but we've had huge success in collaborations with partner agencies. For example, United Neighborhood Centers is rehabbing for us, for the Women's Resource Center program participants, a very large home in Scranton that could actually house 4 or 5 children. So they're doing the rehab. We certainly don't want to be the landowners because it changes our relationship with our clients. So within the next month or so, we're hopeful that we'll have a family in there. We also are partnering with the Catherine McAuley Center. They have some housing apartments that are a little bit bigger. And finally, on another collaboration with United Neighborhood Centers, they just remodeled a beautiful, I think it used to be an old hospital in Carbondale. And we have several women and their children that have moved into some of the larger apartments. And UNC has also offered us a space there because I think that not only is housing important, but support services. So that you can kind of anticipate if someone is about to fall off the cliff, and get the prevention money out there first before you're looking at eviction. So those are some of the strategies that have worked for us.
I just want to quickly, I promise, is that I very much believe in holistic services. I wouldn't be where I am today without those holistic services, is from parenting classes to helping with short-term and long goal setting. And I can't imagine when you add the layers of domestic violence or youth to those, to those struggles and hurdles, having someone there that can support you is instrumental to success. That's statistically proven, that sometimes you just need a little help, for a little bit of time, and that far-reaching impact is amazing. And I am a testament to that.
Well, I think, and keeping families together is really a goal that we would all like to see happen. So, Peg, is there a gap in what is affordable housing and what is safe, livable, quality housing? And how would you rate or classify the options and choices that currently exist?
There's definitely a gap in terms of taking a look at what kind of apartment we might want to live in. And, clients and program participants having to settle for less just to get a roof over their head. And if they don't have a roof over their head, then comes OIFIS, and now you have a whole other new set of problems perhaps with your children having to go, live somewhere else. So there's definitely a gap there. What we've done here at the center is we have established relationships with landowners, both here in Lackawanna County and Susquehanna County. And we talk with them regularly because we know there's going to be problems. I mean, and we've set aside a budget to repair damages so that if someone does something bad, then we can fix it and then we can move the next woman in there. But we work hands in hands, like Mary Pat just said. We go out to the apartments with survivors. We make sure that, at least they're livable. And the landowner then knows that they're going to rely on our check every month so that, there's no, risk of them not getting paid. And so I think that's a strategy that's helpful too with those gaps.
Maureen, I see you shaking your head quite a bit. How would you respond to that question?
Oh, absolutely. I 100% agree with Peg, is developing relationships with local landlords. That's where we're in that stage ourselves right now, because you want your organization to have a good reputation so that they will take your next client. And we do guarantee the rental payment so the landlord doesn't have to worry about being stuck holding the bag, and damage deposits as well. My first teen who was homeless, we had him, we referred him to another organization at first, and they found an apartment for him that was, I would call atrocious. I wouldn't have put my dog in it. The cabinet doors were falling off. The carpet was filthy. There was mouse droppings. And this was supposedly after it was cleaned. There were holes in the wall. And even this young man was sort of appalled, like, I'm supposed to live here. And it was an emergency, so we didn't have much of a choice. And at the time, we didn't have our rapid rehousing program. But I personally, since we started our rapid rehousing program, I take our kids and I examine the apartment myself with them. And I point out issues or concerns that they should be aware of. And I won't let them take an apartment that is not livable. It's sometimes it's fairly, we do have a lot of landlords from out of the area who do not take good care of their properties. And we do have a few local landlords who don't take care of their properties. And they do rent them out for in what we would call lower prices, but they are, some are pretty awful. And I'm lucky that the 3 apartments that we have secured have been decent and well maintained, and the landlords are very agreeable to the circumstances of our children. So,
and knowing the limited income with which you're trying to deal with to place someone in, or a family in, a safe, affordable home, what are the opportunities? How difficult is it, or how easy is it to find? And is there, for lack of a better term, a waiting list to try to find a place for someone to find housing?
I don't place families, but I can tell you it has been difficult to find apartments, say under $700 a month, that are in decent condition. You really have to look. You have to go visit apartment after apartment after apartment to be able to find something that is decent, in my mind. I'm sure somebody else can speak to that for families.
Yeah, we've had.
If I could just, I think another thing that at least we've been seeing lately, and Maureen, I'm right with you on that. It's so difficult to find decent house. The average, I mean, for an average apartment in this area, you're talking about anywhere between a $600 and $800 range, which will get you probably a fairly decent living space, depending upon the individual. But again, and I hate to keep going back to this, the pandemic has kind of thrown a different twist onto this. Well, guess what, guys? We all learned that we can all work from home now. So it doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Manhattan or Philadelphia or Scranton, Pennsylvania, you can work from home with your computer. I know in my own neighborhood, I can cite 3 different places that were purchased at a pretty decent rate by individuals who came from out of the area, who are now living in Scranton to work from home. And what that causes is the rates for decent apartments are starting to go up because landlords know they can get those rates. And the number of available decent living spaces is starting to go down. And I think as we move forward, and this is my own opinion, I mean, I could cite chapter and verse of individuals that I've talked to or spoken with that what the pandemic has caused is it has taught all of us that I could sit in my dining room and do my work from 9 to 5, so I don't have to go to my office. And that seems to be the new normal. So I think you're going to see, we had the great migration out of Scranton of our young people. I think what we're going to start seeing is a great inbound of individuals who may be leaving the major metropolitan areas because it's cheaper to live here. And although we think the rents are expensive, they're much cheaper than what they're paying in other areas. So I think that's going to cause a lack of affordable, not only a lack of affordable, but just a lack of living spaces in general.
Supply and demand, Gary.
Right, exactly, Linda. That's exactly right. And I understand exactly what Maureen's saying because we see that all the time.
Peg, I think you were going to offer something.
I was going to say we've had trouble, more trouble helping women and their children get into apartments. The moratorium is wonderful, for people who can't afford rent, but there's no movement. And that's affected our list, as well as what Gary just said about, lack of units.
Linda, I
Thank
don't mean
you.
to interrupt. I do want to say that there was a question in the Q&A that was very much on the same vein of this, so it might be a good time to introduce this question if you're okay with that. It says, how can agencies advocate against the recent inflation in rent in our area due to families moving out of large cities to smaller cities, such as Scranton, lack of properties available due to the pandemic? While there was already slim pickings for apartments available, the majority of them are not affordable for the majority of our renters, especially with the lack of utilities being included in rent. And so that question really can cut. She says that can go to anybody, but it is a great question. And I know we also have in our audience today, Sarah Levy, who's a real estate agent and WIP supporter, who could also probably attest to the influx and therefore lack of availability. So.
Well, I'll just tell you, that's a great question. And if I knew the simple answer to that, I think I'd be like winning the lottery. As Linda said, it is supply and demand, and it's a if you're a landlord out there that has an apartment, it's a decent apartment, are they going to rent it to me for $600, or are they going to rent it to someone who's willing to pay $900? I mean, I don't know how you would go about advocating or changing that.
Yeah.
And I would suspect that, as Jesse mentioned earlier, the aging stock of housing that we have in our area kind of more off the market, even more so, because you can't really flex those living arrangements.
Yeah, it costs a lot to retrofit the types of properties we have here in northeastern Pennsylvania to make them rentals. It does, and then it takes a lot of resources to change them back. That's just the nature of the housing stock that was built. Many other regions, many other areas have a lot more multifamily affordable housing available to them. And I should say that with a qualification that we know, Federal Reserve Bank has done studies on this. There's been other studies across the Commonwealth of a severe shortage in affordable housing for low and very low income people. This isn't like just a Scranton problem, a Lackawanna County problem, northeastern Pennsylvania problem. As Gary mentioned earlier, it's a systemic thing that we're seeing across the Commonwealth, across the country, and we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of units short of what it would take to house all the people who need affordable housing. And so, this isn't just a matter of how do we build 100 units here or there. This is a systemic issue. And but that being said, Northeastern Pennsylvania, the way that our housing stock has been built, mostly single family, detached, might be 2 units, 4 units, but you don't see a significant amount of multifamily properties here like you would see in some other areas. And I think we just have this kind of decade-long kind of backlog of activity on that front. United Neighborhood Centers does a great job. Catholic Social Services has done a great job over the years. There's Midtown Apartments, there's Housing Authority, but those, that is not a significant amount when you look at the number of people who need those units. It's just not. It was not even close. And so decades in other regions, there's been decades worth of effort and energy going into LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit projects and other things that have been trying to solve this problem a couple hundred units at a time that hasn't been happening as aggressively here. So, I think that's, we're talking about kind of a major issue that, goes way beyond the current market swing of prices changing because people coming in from out of town, those are things that could change again in a couple of years, right? When the trend changed. The lack of affordable housing is a long-term systemic issue.
Thank you, Jesse. And it gets to the next question, which is really, homeownership has always been an essential component of the American dream. It is one of the most important ways for low-income and minority households to build wealth and move up the economic ladder. Yet, low and moderate income families face a number of barriers to home ownership. What do you think are the barriers they face, and what can we do to support?
So I just painted a gloomy picture, and I'm sorry about that when it came to affordable housing, but I'll paint a brighter picture when it comes to home ownership, because I think in a community like ours, the amount of affordable single family properties that people could actually purchase and become homeowners, it makes it absolutely possible for people to achieve that dream of home ownership, where in many other communities, for a working class person, it's not possible without other types of significant investment. And so, that's the good news, is that we have a lot of affordable housing when it comes to home ownership. And that's also a reason why Gary's seeing new neighbors move in from out of town and all these other things happening, because people are recognizing that, right? They're saying, hey, wait, Scranton's got great value. Northeastern Pennsylvania has a great value when it comes to what I can get for my home ownership dollar, and the community's great. All the things that we know and love about this region, other people recognize that too, and the housing is still there. When we talk about barriers, I think there's always going to be kind of these barriers that are in place for modest income folks, especially single folks, especially single women, single mothers. That's things like understanding how to build and use credit wisely is always an issue that we see. Right. Understanding and having those long-term financial goals and being able to walk through that, as Mary Pat referred to earlier. And then the big one is saving for a down payment. It's just how do you put money away for a down payment when you're kind of living paycheck to paycheck? That's always an issue. So those are kind of the pragmatic goals and those issues that we're kind of dealing with on a process basis. But what I would always go back to is I think the biggest barrier we always see when it comes to home ownership is a mindset barrier, right? It's this this kind of mindset that it isn't possible for me to be a homeowner, right? Because my parents weren't homeowners, my grandparents weren't homeowners, and I just don't see that as something that's part of my story, right? And I think that is something that takes more work to change. It's more work than just creating a down payment assistance program or teaching people credit. It's saying, no, look, like insert yourself in this picture of this person standing in front of this home that's theirs, right? Like that's a big deal. And we have to change the mindset that people can say, this is something I can achieve here in Northeastern Pennsylvania because the housing is affordable. And actually, when I look at the numbers, and when we look at the numbers, it may be more affordable to purchase a home than it is to try to find that mystery rental property that we're all talking about that nobody can find, right? So it's just a matter of how do we change some of those mindsets and say, like, there's barriers, yes, but we can work with those, and we can deal with those and fix them.
And I think that mindset goes not only into home ownership, but also goes into safe and affordable housing, and what is acceptable in a lifestyle choice that provides and promotes safety. And I'm being very mindful of our clock and the time that we have left. And I'm going to throw this question out to everyone is, what would you like to see happen in our region to begin effectively addressing housing affordability?
I have a suggestion. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Maureen.
My suggestion is we've seen a lot of redevelopment of old buildings, especially in downtown Scranton, into quote unquote luxury apartments for $9, $10, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400. Those are out of reach for a lower or moderate income family. I'd like to take some of those buildings and make them low income and moderate income housing opportunities for families, particularly. And it can be done. I really think that it can be done financially and still get an investor to get a good return on their investment. But I don't know how many luxury apartments Scranton needs, but we certainly need a lot more low income and medium income apartments.
Well, even if they were mixed usage, because I don't know a lot about this research, but I've read about bringing, low, moderate, and higher income families together nearby makes a big difference in terms of the health of the community. I also think there's been some success in other cities, at least that I'm aware of through my network, where within safety parameters to really take a look at the codes to rehab an old building. And, is there a way to maintain safety of those buildings without having owners jump through so many hoops that are expensive?
And
Maura,
I think if I could just throw out there, I think Jesse hit the nail on the head on a couple of different points. And I guess I'll throw a positive spin on this as well. And I'm looking around this board that I'm here, and we're very fortunate in this community is that everyone who's on this call collaborates at one point in time or another, provides a partnership to make some good things happen. I personally, I have a tendency sometimes to get very frustrated. We have an emergency services program that helps pay rent for individuals who are facing eviction, whether it's like a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road. And it's an important program. It stops people from being out on the street. But I always step out of that and say, but what are we doing but putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound? Like, how do we make sure that next May, the same family isn't coming back to us again? I would love to see, and again, Jesse brought up the whole education piece, educating people on budget counseling services that are available. But not only that, but educating them to the point of where you can buy a home, you can live in a livable apartment, and this is the way you do it, and having a one-stop shop so that families and individuals don't have to jump around from agency to agency to agency. Those of us who have had to do that in another lifetime know how frustrating that can get, and you just give up. And that would be, an ultimate dream. If I could wave the magic wand, that would be the ultimate dream.
I think some of that has to come in, Gary, and for all with lobbying of those in leadership, because there was a shift, and I know some of our social service agencies will understand the difference between transitional housing and bridge housing and what is now rapid rehousing. That really changed the dynamic of how we can care for people in a holistic approach. Transitional housing was up to 2 years, usually like a period of 18 months to 2 years, where you could really provide time for people. How do you provide that in a rapid rehousing world where you're only allowed to give help for 3 to 6 months? How does someone change
exactly
life at that time? It's impossible. We need to lobby those in power to change that dynamic, because we were just getting there with transitional housing and bridge housing and finding those programs and services and those collaborations. And unfortunately, it was taken away from us. Yeah.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Maura?
I just wanted to mention what Maureen mentioned earlier about the low income housing. I'd like to see a faster process into the low income housing. I think the wait list is extremely long, which causes families to, become homeless. They end up in hotels or on the streets, and they're on a wait list for housing. But I would love to see a faster process to that.
And I also understand that the application process itself is fairly complicated and complex for
Much
many of our families.
Yes.
And for everyone, in the short term, what can be done?
Well, I think I see some of like that we're doing it as a community for the short term, which is shifting with the public policies, being able to keep our eyes open to change some of those policies. The collaborations I think that we have in this community are outstanding. And, to build on what Mary Pat said, to be able to advocate to have a longer term work with a family in housing not only helps them stabilize themselves, but it gives them the message that they're worth it, which leads then to some of what Jesse was talking about. So many of the women we work with have had their spirits broken, that, getting through every day is hard enough, let alone thinking that somebody really cares about you and, that you're worth the work we're doing with you.
And if I could just throw out one last thing, and it's keep beating the drum. I have seen this many times. That sometimes we look at the what I call the crisis du jour. Today it's housing, so let's talk about housing, and then tomorrow it's going to be something else. So let's forget about housing and move on to another issue. I think what we have to continue doing as a network, as government entities, as social service workers, is continue to beat this drum and talk about the problem of affordable housing, and not just let it go by the wayside because some other issue comes up.
I have a feeling that this brain trust that's been assembled here this evening, if anyone can get us there, it's this group of wonderful colleagues. And, Laura, I think we're probably at the time that we're near close, so I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I would agree that this group could definitely accomplish all the things that we are talking about tonight. And I want to thank our wonderful panel for joining us tonight to talk about the opportunities that exist to make increased difference in accessible and affordable housing, and to our excellent moderator, Linda Champi. Thank you for the wonderful job you did moderating this panel. It speaks to so much of the connectivity that I think we've seen through Women in Philanthropy already. When we talk about some of the priority areas that we've invested in, one of the key ones over the past 7 years was financial confidence. And really what that means is it's a match savings program. It's financial education, it's building confidence, and it's match savings. And it speaks to what so many have talked about tonight, about just that need for support through the down payment process, because for 60 graduates of that, over 25% chose to save for a down payment on a home. And so it really speaks to the need about how these interconnect and the importance of that need, as well as so many others that were illustrated tonight. So I want to thank you again very much. This is the first of 2 recorded webinars that will lay the groundwork for potential Women in Philanthropy focus on affordable housing. And the follow-up webinar will include additional examples of some solution-focused models that we can consider as we work towards our goal of working towards addressing these important areas. So thank you again to all of you for your wonderful and for your work in our community. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks
Have
for
a good
having
night.
us.
Thanks, Maggie.
For your support of
Good
Women in
evening.
Philanthropy.
Good night, everybody.
It's good to
Thanks.
see all of you.